This chapter examines chance and probability in the social sciences. Ultimately, it is a recognition that sometimes we have to overlook random events as being random. We don't have to analyze everything. Sometimes the probability is that something remarkable will happen, and there doesn't have to be some underlying reason to explain that. Now, humans have a tendency to develop narratives that explain such chance happenings or random events because we want there to be some meaning behind it. So even if there is no meaning, we tend to find one or imbue random events with some sort of inherent meaning. And so the purpose of this chapter is to, I guess, practice recognizing the application of probability of things happening to perhaps familiar experiences that we've had. So, chance and randomness are integral parts of our environment. This is a quote I'm pulling out of Stanovich's 11th chapter of the How to Think Straight About Psychology. The mechanisms of biological evolution and genetic recombination are governed by laws of chance and randomness. So these are laws that we've discovered in biology and genetics, and they're explained by probability. And so the fact that humans have evolved the way that they have isn't because there was some divine mechanic working at the gears to make sure, like directing the evolution. There were random mutations in genetic sequences, and some of those random mutations turned out to have survival value. And then that genetic line continued, and that one genetic line continued over another is survival value, is Darwin's hypothesis about evolution. But that a genetic mutation occurred was completely random. So we don't need to have a reason behind why the mutation occurred. We can, however, explain why that one mutation survived more so than another. I've mentioned this before in the probability chapter. We know that if we were to flip a coin, we would have a 50% chance of it turning up heads. But that doesn't mean that I can predict or you can predict what will happen when you flip a coin. All we can say is there's a 50% probability that it will be heads, and 50% probability that it will be tails. The same thing with whether or not a certain medication will help with ADHD or autism or depression or anxiety. We can say with confidence what the probability of its effectiveness will be given the population and its generalizability to the person in question, but we can't predict exactly how it will work. This might be frustrating, but it's one of the limitations of using statistics to state the probability of things happening, so this all follows from the previous chapter. So we are conditioned, almost, to find an explanatory narrative when there isn't one. And so this chapter is going to kind of point out how we don't always need to explain why something happens. So here are a couple of examples that Stanovich uses, and they're pretty well known in the social science of economics, which, by the way, is one of the social sciences that tries the most, or maybe in the most explicit way, to show that there's scientific formulae for predicting the stock market, but no one can predict what will happen. We can say the probability of what will happen based on past trends and tendencies of how people act, but the economics is such a wide and complex system with so many moving parts, including the psychology of spending and saving and the psychology of money, politics, and so on. So there are people who make a living predicting the stock market. And as long as this has been studied, so how good are stock market analysts at predicting the stock market? Well, they're historically pretty bad at it. So it's pretty shocking that the job continues, why people will pay someone to predict the stock market when there's no evidence that people can do this. every year I'm shocked by this. Stock market analysts make a lot of money. They're hired by most companies to manage their funds. And when I say they're not very good at it, I mean they're not as good as someone who just picked a little bit of every stock that's available in the Standard & Poor 500, the 500 biggest companies in the US stock market exchange. If you sort of like mindlessly bought up all of those and then didn't pay anyone, you're getting the cheapest. I mean, you're not paying the extra money to have someone tell you what to buy, and you will outperform 80 to 90% of the stock market analysts year after year. Now, people still pay a lot of money to have someone manage, to tell them how to invest, and so that means that we believe the stock market can be predicted, even though there's no evidence that it can. So why does stock market analysis continue to be a well-paid job? Well, some people do outperform the stock market, but that doesn't mean that they can predict it. It just means that the probability of someone out of all stock market analysts predicting better than the S&P 500 isn't zero. Some will do it. Just if we had a random selection, some of those random picks will actually do okay. And I think there is, Stanovich gives the example. If we trained monkeys to throw darts, and this was his example, throw darts, and then whatever the dart hits is the stock that they buy, well, a certain percentage of those monkeys are going to pick the right stocks randomly, and then the other ones will not. That doesn't mean that we should invest our money with them. I give the example here of pulling bananas from a bucket. So this actually comes in the Stanovich book, but I remember it from J.L. Collins' Simple Path to Wealth. This is a book that if you're interested in the basics of personal finance, Collins covers it very succinctly and simply. So now imagine that you receive a letter, or I guess an email or text message, saying that you should buy stock A. You don't owe me any money for this, just here's my recommendation, buy it. And you're like, I don't know you, I'm gonna delete. And then you check up like a month later and find out that stock A doubled in value in 1 month, which is crazy. So then you're like, okay, maybe there's something to that. You get another text message from the same number, and it says buy stock F. So you're like, I'm kind of interested, but I don't trust you yet. Stock F doubles. You're like, okay, there's something to this. Then like a month later, you find out that the same text, or you get another text, and they say to buy stock G or whatever, and then stock G doubles, and you're like, what? That's 3 for 3. And then you get a text message saying, hey, if you want me to be your financial advisor, this is what I charge. I'm 3 for 3. You're gonna spend a bunch of money, make a lot of money. What do you do? So think about that. This person just went 3 for 3. Clearly they're good. The probability of that happening is very low. And they did it with you. How did they do it? Should you invest your money in them? Well, the probability of them doing it with just you would be very low. Let's say the probability of a stock increasing, I didn't do the math here, but let's say the probability of a stock increasing is 20%, and the probability of it staying the same or decreasing would be 80% combined. Well, then you've got 20% times 20% times 20%. You're getting pretty low there. You're like 0.008%. It's a very small percentage of increasing value like that. So they did that with you. Does that mean they're actually very good? Well, imagine that this person sent out text messages to 1,000 people and gave them all different predictions. And then 20% of those predictions turned out to be right. And so now they ignored the other 800 people who got crappy predictions and only focused on the remaining 200 and gave them all predictions. Well, 20% of those were right, so that's 40 people. Now 40 people got perfect predictions, 2 for 2, and now there's a third prediction. Again, we say 20% of them get perfect predictions, and so now there's 8 people who got 3 for 3. They all get this targeted text message saying, buy from me. Yeah, they leave out the other 992 people, but now 8 people are really interested in spending money with them. It's just a con scheme, and we can understand it just using applied probability. Now, related to what we're talking about here, chance and randomness, is the appearance of a correlation. And so this is an illusory correlation. We think that two variables are related, and we tend to recognize evidence that they are created. So for example, have you ever been like thinking of your mom or dad or grandmother, and then you get a text message from them, or someone asks you about them, or say that they were thinking about them at the same time, and you just think, wow, what are the odds of that? And or maybe you have a dream where you and you think that the dream predicts the future, and then it turns out it does predict the future. So you dreamt that something about Venezuela, and then you found out that your cousin was going to move to Venezuela. And you're like, oh my gosh, I just dreamt that. How amazing is that? And it is amazing. It's a remarkable coincidence, but there isn't any relationship between those two things. And you can break this down too. In a given day, you might have 100 or 500 thoughts, specific thoughts or ideas, or ideas that are brought to you by other people, or maybe you watch them on television or YouTube or TikTok. And so all of those, like hundreds and hundreds of things that cross your mind, and then the hundreds and hundreds of external activities and events that occur, how many of them are going to correspond? So you've got like a group of 200 here and a group of 200 here. What are the odds that any one of those 200 of each have some sort of direct relationship? And the odds aren't perfect, but there's still odds. Like it may happen once a week, or like once a month, or even once a year, and we think that they're truly remarkable, but they're really just the probability. There's nothing special about them. We also like to believe that we're in control of our lives. And so as a college professor, I feel like in my own reflection on courses, if a course goes well, I feel like I did something to make it go well. And if a course goes poorly, I think I did something to make it go poorly. Like, I think that I'm partially responsible for that. I even get this sometimes, like watching a sports team that I like, and if they do poorly, I think like, oh, I shouldn't have worn that shirt. They would have done better. I did the same thing as like a baseball player. If I didn't like enter the infield the right way, that maybe I would be more prone to an error, or if I didn't wear the right hat, that like we would lose. But ultimately, we don't have control over these events. There's so many other factors that are responsible for the outcomes that are minimal involvement or lack of involvement isn't going to explain or be able to help predict how something will happen. This was a pretty well-studied comparison of variables. We often at university ask students to evaluate their professors at the end of the semester. But meta-analyses have shown that there's really no relationship between what sort of ratings an instructor gets and what they do in the classroom, that there's so many other factors, confounding factors that influence what the outcomes actually are. But we still kind of believe that students can evaluate their instructors and that those evaluations are important. In fact, for my evaluation to my university, it's one of the biggest indicators of whether or not I'll be promoted. This is another example of these like illusions of control. This is called the belief in a just world. And a belief in a just world is common, especially for people who are well off or comfortable in life. They believe that they did something for it, or that ultimately, belief in a just world is that good people get good things, bad people get bad things, that the world is not chaotic and random, it is governed by justice. Justice prevails. So if you believe in a just world, then you might believe that people who are in prison are there because they did something bad, that they made mistakes, and those mistakes were bad enough to land them in prison. So they wouldn't have really any way to predict why Martin Luther King Jr. was put in jail twice in this city of Albany, Georgia, they'd say, well, I guess maybe he did something really bad. Like, yeah, he was great as a civil rights activist, but he must have done something really bad. If you believe in a just world, you have to justify why a bad thing happens to a good person. Another common explanation is poor people are poor because they haven't worked hard enough. They should get a job. And that's a belief in a just world assumption that if you have money, you've done something to earn it. And if you don't have money, then you have not done that thing to earn it. Where in fact there are other forces, especially in capitalist economies, where you have to have capital in order to earn capital. And if you start off without capital, you're at a huge disadvantage just right out of the gate. There's nothing just about that. We also try to explain events in our lives using a narrative. This is something interesting that I study in qualitative research. So I wound up at Albany State University, and there were a couple of random events that led to my being here. It wasn't some divine operator. It wasn't me planning out my career. They say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him or her your plans, or them your plans. That's sort of the case. If you want to predict what you're going to do in life, make those predictions very loosely, because something else will probably happen. I went to West Georgia because of the author of an article I happened to read at just the right time was an alumnus of West Georgia. And then I was offered this job at Darden State College, now Albany State University, because there was a professor of psychology retiring whose name was also Dr. Whitehead. And so they're like, hey, let's interview this guy. And that was like one of the only interviews I got. They were both coincidental. So a coincidence is an accidental occurrence of related events. And there's no explanation needed. How did a Whitehead wind up replacing another Whitehead? What's the likelihood of that? Pretty low in a non-English city, but not impossible. So we're the only Whiteheads who've ever worked at this university. Still, and what's the odds that we're both going to be psychologists? Pretty low, pretty rare. But the fact that they saw my name as being the same, like that increased the likelihood that I'd get hired. And that had nothing to do with me. That was just purely coincidental. So coincidences occur due to random chance. With the sheer number of variables for which remarkable coincidences can occur, they happen often, but that doesn't make them any more meaningful. So my university hires probably 30 faculty a year across all the colleges. What are the odds that we'll replace one of those faculty members with another one of the same name? It's not zero. And so after a series of years, it'll probably happen once a decade. And that's just by sheer probability. There doesn't need to be some like ulterior mechanics that we need to explain. Personal coincidences happen too, and so you might think that if they happen to you, there must be something else at play. There must be something to explain, or what did I do to make that happen? When in fact, it's just random chance. So my wife and I met on chance.com. I'm just joking with that, but it was a website. And we met because my subscription was ending. I did like the minimum subscription, and she did the minimum, but they overlapped by 3 days. And so it was like the last time I was logging on, and it was like the first time she was logging on, and we just happened to make that connection. Again, it was a coincidence. There wasn't anything special happening. And then like there were a bunch of other coincidences where we had lived in the same apartment but never met. We had both recently graduated from grad school, and it was our first like professional job. We both moved to the same city. We had all this stuff in common, which was rare for this city. We fell in love and got married, but it was all like remarkable, but a coincidence. I don't need to explain what made it happen. I don't need to spend any more time thinking about it, other than maybe like being grateful that it happened. Today is actually our anniversary, 8 years. So we're still on this idea of like chance and randomness and probability. And one of the ironies here is when we accept error in our effectiveness with predictions, we can actually be better predictors. So if we know that there's a 40% chance of something happening, and we accept that 60% of the time we'll be wrong, we're going to have a better probability of being helpful or being accurate if we accept our limited odds of being right. And so I'll give a specific example in psychology in a second. But the study, and this has been done multiple times, but the one that Stanovich talks about is participants were sat in this little, like, I guess a dark room, I imagine, and there was a green light and a red light. And they blinked they blinked randomly, so like it would either be red or green, but there was no predicting exactly which one it would be. It was random which one happened next. But over the entire hour, 70% would be red, or excuse me, 70% would be green, 30% would be red. And the participants sort of figured this out. Okay, I'm getting a lot of green, not as many red, but just because the majority of the flashes were green didn't mean that the next flash would be green. It just means that the most likely flash would be green. Once the participants figured this out, their probability of getting it right increased a little bit, but not to 70%. So if you knew that the green light would flash 70% of the time, then you would mostly pick the green light, but you'd say, oh, there's been a lot of green. I'm going to go with red this next time, because you're assuming that you can do better than the odds at predicting what light will flash next. And when this was played out, they were about 58% effective at picking the correct light. But if you knew that 70% of the time it would be green, wouldn't you just pick green every time? Because then you'd be guaranteed 70% accuracy. But if we try to beat the odds, we do worse. And in this example, we do 12% worse. In the stock market example, 80% do worse than the mindless automated buying of index funds, which is what J.L. Collins in The Simple Path to Wealth recommends. Just buy index funds. That's what I do. What about clinical prediction? Okay, so let's say that Dr. Ripken, I'm stealing a name from Cal Ripken, Dr. Ripken knows that approximately 40% of children with ADHD benefit from medication A. Other medications exist, but they are not as good as medication A. So Dr. Ripken knows a child named Tommy personally and has a pretty good idea of what Tommy's symptoms are and believes he can be more helpful to Tommy. Do you think that Dr. Ripken can predict better than 40% which medication will work for Tommy? And so that's a question for you to think about. And ultimately the answer is no. Dr. Ripken, just like the participants trying to guess which light will flash next, is best served by following the actuarial prediction tables, which is following statistical probability. If medication A is the most effective, and that effectiveness is 40%, then he can't beat 40% in predicting what medication Tommy needs. Make sure I got that name right, yep. If he tries to predict which medication will be best, we can expect that Dr. Ripken will do worse than 40%. Maybe not 0% effective, but worse than 40%. So the best action would be to become a machine and say, probability says that 40% of people get better using medication A, and that's the best option. We will monitor Tommy's condition and see if medication A isn't effective and move on to B and so on. That's it. So ultimately, there's nothing special in trying to understand chance and random events. They occur. We don't need to spend any more time thinking about them. If they happen so frequently that perhaps probability and chance are not the explanations, maybe there's more work to be done. But until then, there's really no need to spend more time thinking about it.